What's going on, everyone? Cash Creatures here. And today we're going to be taking a look at the summer slowdown and seeing if it's a real thing by looking at real data and price movements of Pokemon cards over time. So let's get right into it. So first we have the Bubble Mew, the iconic card that pretty much personifies the Pokemon bubble. And if we take a look at the price of this card back in April of 2024, we were sitting around $92, so a lot lower than it is right now. And then for the next few months, we pretty much just stagnated in that $85 to $95 price range. And then around September of 2024, for the next few months, that's when we actually went crazy, maybe like a 4 to 5x, and hit about $400 raw in February 2025. And then over the next few months, we actually went down to 300 and stagnated in that range for the next few months. So all the way from April 2025 to June of 2025, we stagnated. And, technically that's part of the summer. Maybe you could even say that's springtime. But over June, July, and August, we pretty much had like a 2x. And then the card went, even crazier after that and peaked around September or October. So technically last year in the summer, the Bubble Mew actually went crazy. And it's not just the Bubble Mew. We're going to see this pattern for a lot of cards. Right now, certain chase cards that were released in the past year or so, but not super new, for example, the Mega Charizard EX, this card is definitely slowing down in a PSA 10. If we take a look at the PSA 10 chart here, back in March of this year, we were selling for about $2,700, $2,800. And now this card is definitely down to about $2,100, $2,200 maybe. So this card has definitely felt some of that summer slowdown that we're seeing this year. But for the case of this card, you can't attribute the price decline to a summer slowdown. This is still a fairly new card, and a lot of the copies are coming back right now as PSA 10s. It's a very easy to grade card, has over 25,000 population already, I believe. And, that realization is kind of hitting the market. So this card is getting repriced accordingly, and now it's in the low 2000s. But it hasn't really broken below 2000, right? It's actually holding pretty strong for what it's worth. And we haven't really seen any sales below 2000. Maybe you might have sniped an auction on eBay or got some local deal under 2000, but the market would agree that this is, slightly over a $2,000 card in a PSA 10. And the raw price has been holding strong as well in the high 800s. And taking a look at the top chase card from Scarlet and Violet era, the Umbreon EX from Prismatic Evolutions, this card hasn't really seen much of a summer slowdown at all. It was selling for about 7,500, a couple weeks ago, which is pretty much its all-time high. And right now it's selling for about 7,000, 7,200, something like that. So not much of a summer slowdown for the Umbreon EX. For the Umbreon VMAX from Evolving Skies, the PSA 10 was selling for about maybe 4,600 to 4,800 at the peak. And now it's closer to 4,200, 4,400. I would say between 42 and 44. There is a high sale here at 47, but otherwise we're pretty close in that 42, 44 range. I did check this sale. That's a 6,000. It's a fake sale. And taking a look at Pikachu EX, another top chase card from Scarlet Violet era. This card in a PSA 10 was probably around 1,200, 1,300 max at its very peak. And now it's closer to about 1,050 to 1,100. Probably 1,100 right now is a fair price for this card. So again, not too much of a slowdown, barely even a correction. I would just say at this point, it just looks like stagnation more than anything. But we are seeing money move away from certain parts of the market, and that's without a doubt. And the data supports that as well. For example, Chinese cards, I've definitely seen these cards come down in price recently. The Gengar Pikachu, beautiful illustration, very cool, very nostalgic. The PSA 10 for this card did go as high as like $5,000 and, even like some higher sales, $5,600, $5,500. But now it's gone all the way back down to about $4,000 to $4,500. So we have seen money leave certain areas of the market and, pretty much dry up in terms of liquidity. Same thing with the Gengar, the Chinese Gengar exclusive. Super dope artwork. And this card was selling for about $750 to $800 in a PSA 10 not too long ago. And again, we are seeing some of that liquidity dry up. Some of these auctions are ending low, right, in the $550 to $600 range. Maybe you can even get some in the $500 range for this card in a PSA 10. So I do think certain Chinese cards right now are getting to a price point where they might actually be good buys. And, we are seeing pretty significant downturns in these cards. If we say this card went from 800 to 600 in a PSA 10, that's a 25% decrease. So pretty substantial correction there. But it is a bit misleading to say that the summer slowdown kind of happens every year. It's this cyclical thing that just, it happens. People go on vacations in the summer, they're spending more time doing other things, maybe playing sports, whatever the case may be. So we see some money leave the hobby. And, I think that's true to a certain extent. I think there is a correlation between the summer months and, prices of Pokemon collectibles in general. But it's not so cut and dry to the point where you say every summer, these set of months is going to come with a slowdown in the Pokemon market, right? It's not that simple. And, the data clearly supports that. So if we take a look at another top chase card from Scarlet Violet era, Magikarp, back in 2025, if we start from April and then we take a look how this price performed just last year in April, right? The beginning of the summer, you could say. We kept going up all the way to about September 2025. And that was actually kind of the trend last year, where the summer slowdown was actually front loaded. The summer slowdown actually happened from January to March, which isn't really a summer slowdown, right? But that's when the slowdown of last year happened, the stagnation period where prices kind of cooled off a bit, gave maybe 10%, 20% back, and kind of just stagnated in a range for quite a while before seeing any explosive growth. And that kind of happened because there was a big run near the end of 2024 for a lot of cards. And then they experienced that slowdown a bit early before the summer. And during the summer months of last year, we actually saw price appreciation pretty much all across the board. Taking a look at another chase card from Scarlet Violet, the Charizard EX from Obsidian Flames. Back in April of 2025, we stagnated until about June. But then June, July, August, we pretty much were going crazy. Even September, that's kind of when we peaked, right? And the stagnation period of last year was actually from February to about May, June. That May to June time period is when we kind of bottomed out. And, after that, we kind of picked up the pace again and started seeing some price movement. And looking at the Greninja EX from Twilight Masquerade, an SIR chase card, back in 2025, from March all the way to August is when we had a stagnation period and a bit of a correction. And then August, September is kind of where we went up a little bit. And then we actually had a slowdown earlier this year already in pretty much the winter months. And it looks like the spring, summer months, this card was actually increasing a bit. So this is kind of one of those cards that breaks the pattern. There's no clear cyclicality with this card. I think, it kind of just goes in cycles just like everything else. There's upticks and then there's consolidation periods and then upticks. And taking a look at the Pikachu EX from Surging Sparks back in 2025, we were pretty much coming down in price all the way from January to July. And then July, August, September is when we had a bit of an uptick and peaked in about October of 2025. And if you guys remember this Drowsy from Scarlet and Violet base, this was a huge card back in the boom of early 2025. And, this card peaked at about almost $100. There was definitely sales near that $90 to $100 range back in February of 2025. Since this card has been out for so long, we can actually get more data and see how this card has performed over time, especially in the summer months. So in April of 2023, we were sitting at about $8. And we did stagnate until about June. And then we went from about $6.60 to $10. So actually, not too shabby of a price hike. That's about 50% right there in a couple months. And then after that is when we had that stagnation period for over a year. And then in 2024, we actually went from $7.80 in June to about $11.50 in August of 2024. So another 50% increase over a 3-month period in the summer. And then we had the huge explosive growth near the end of the year into the winter, into February of 2025. And then that's when we really stagnated. The big crash / stagnation period was all the way from February 2025 to looks like March of 2026 this year. But then those spring and summer months have been pretty kind to this card, and looks like it about, doubled up, maybe a little bit more since, the past 4 months. So I guess the main takeaways from what I'm trying to show you guys here is that, last year we had a bit of a run into pretty much the winter of 2024 to the first couple months of 2025. And then that stagnation period, or the summer slowdown, actually started all the way back in the end of February and March. And that's when we kind of went down in price a bit. The stagnation wasn't just in the summer for certain cards, right? This one, it was all the way through the winter. And then early this year is when we started picking up again. And taking a look at a couple of alt arts, we have the Lugia V from Silver Tempest. In 2024, May, we were at about $190, and we stagnated in the summer all the way until November of 2024. We saw some explosive growth, stagnated in the spring, and then around June, July, August, we started picking up again into the fall. So similar pattern here as well in terms of, where the money was moving during which time periods. And taking a look at the Rayquaza VMAX from Evolving Skies, back in 2024, around June, or rather May, June, all the way to November is kind of when we had about a 10% correction, maybe stagnated for a few months, and went up to about $600 in March of 2025. And pretty much, the next year or so was stagnation. And then the spring months of this year, this card started to explode. Maybe it's because of the Delta Rain announcement that was made recently. Even before that, people already knew that we were going to have a Rayquaza set. So maybe that had something to do with this card and why it went up. And the last single card we're going to take a look at today is the Gengar VMAX from Fusion Strike. All the way back in May of 2024, we were at $360 and stagnated during the next few months. In September of 2024, near the end of the year, is when we started picking up again, peaked in about January or February of 2025. And pretty much we had that front-loaded summer slowdown again. And then from June of 2025 all the way to September, we pretty much had about a 50% increase, maybe like a 45% increase. And then another period of stagnation, and then we go on a run again. So I think if anything, we can kind of see that there's not really so much cyclicality in Pokemon to the point where, it's not like ice cream, right? Where in the summer months, obviously people are going to eat more ice cream. It's just a nicer vibe, I guess. And in the winter months, people aren't eating cold sweets as much, right? So there's clear cyclicality there. But with Pokemon cards, people will buy singles for their binder, rip packs, pretty much any time of the year, right? So there is a slight correlation between summer months and low liquidity in the Pokemon market, but I think it's always good to dig a bit deeper than that. So now let's take a look at some sealed product as well and see if we have a correlation here between the summer months and a slowdown in Pokemon. First, let's take a look at the Brilliant Stars booster box. And in March of 2024, all the way to November of 2024, we were pretty much stagnant, maybe a slight increase near the second half of the year. But we did seem to have a slowdown there. And then, we go up about 50% and then chill there from January 2025 to April of 2025. And then in the summer of 2025, we actually had a pretty big bull run for Sword and Shield booster boxes. At this point, we did have the correction in the winter months of last year, and we kind of came back up from that and settled in the $600 range for Brilliant Stars. But at this point, I do expect a good amount of stagnation for this booster box. So I think the summer slowdown is real for this product at least, and several others. For the Fusion Strike booster box as well, unfortunately, this booster box is probably not going to perform so well over this summer. If we take a look all the way in 2024, back in around March and April, we were sitting at about $220 to $230, right after a run in the winter months. And I can understand why people did not want to buy at this price and why the price pretty much stayed stagnant, right? Because at this point, the booster box was only about 2 to 3 years old. And you have to remember that people were buying these booster boxes at $80 to $100 all day. So all of a sudden, not even that old of a booster box, it's pretty much 3x'd since the overprinting era of Sword and Shield, right? It wasn't such a good look back then. Obviously in hindsight, everything's 2020, but pretty much from that $200 range for the next year or so, we were pretty much in a bull run and stagnated from February 2025 all the way to April, really, only 2 months. And then in the summer of 2025, had that huge bull run all the way to $1,000, right? So at this $1,000 price point, again, I do see some stagnation ahead for pretty much most Sword and Shield booster boxes, and maybe even a lot of Scarlet Violet booster boxes. And taking a look at something like an Unbroken Bonds booster box from Sun and Moon, definitely much less supply on the market for something like this. So back in 2024, we got all the way up to $550. And from January of 2024 all the way to November of 2024, looks like we had modest, steady gains, maybe like 30, 40% over the year, which is still pretty good. But in that winter of 2024 to 2025, went on a bit of a bull run. And then from April 2025, stagnated for a few months, had a bull run in the summer of 2025. And then now it's kind of stagnating again, but slowly going up as time passes on. So I think certain booster box prices are not so much affected by the summer slowdown, but rather, supply and demand, how much supply is on the market at that given time, and, how expensive these boxes have gotten over time, right? Because again, this box is $2,400 right now. And, just 2 years ago, it was 1/4 of that price, right? So a lot of people who have boxes sitting around from back then definitely taking profits on this box. And it's just very expensive box too, so prices out a lot of people, especially a lot of people looking to get into slabs now and, vintage grails rather than like booster boxes that can't really bring around and show off to your friends and stuff like that. So makes sense to me. And to close out the video, we'll take a look at the Evolving Skies booster box. So all the way back in 2024 of March, we were sitting at about $660, and we had just come up off another bull run. So that bull run was pretty much from 2023 to March of 2024, where we pretty much had over a 50% increase in the winter months. And that was coming off a huge, very long period of stagnation, right? So from January 2023 all the way to January 2024, the box barely increased in price, maybe like a 20% gain, maybe a 30% gain during that time period. And then we pretty much had a 50% gain within the next 3 months. So again, at that point, a lot of profit takers, and we see a pretty long period of stagnation for the next few months. And September of 2024 through the end of the year, we hit that, $1,200 price point, stagnate there in that $1,200, $1,300 price point, and go on a bull run through the summer of 2025. And now we're pretty much stagnant around that $2,100 to $2,500 price point. We might see some high sales at like $2,700, $2,800, but I do think for this booster box, there is going to be a pretty fat period of stagnation. And for most Sword and Shield booster boxes in general, I think that's what we're looking at. I think Scarlet and Violet booster boxes are slowly going to go up over the next few months, slowly grind upwards and try to fill some of those gaps in between, the Sword and Shield booster box prices and the Scarlet Violet era booster box prices. But for the most part, these are going to be pretty dead money, unfortunately, for the next few months. And really what could catapult this to new highs would be the 30th anniversary, right? During that time when that 30th anniversary set comes out in September, a lot of people are going to be opening the product, right? Maybe that's going to funnel more money into other sealed products as well, because people just want to catch that opening bug and see what they can pull and see what kind of rare packs they can rip. So maybe we'll see a bit of a boom around that September timeframe. If not, we could see something later in the year in those winter months when it gets a bit colder. Maybe people are going to be at home with their friends and family, opening Pokemon cards, right? So anything is possible, but at least for the next 3 months or so, I think a lot of sealed product is going to be fairly stagnant. And I think a lot of singles, are going to be priced accordingly. If something's undervalued, I think it's going to start creeping up. But if something's, a bit inflated and it's just run up a lot recently, I think that's going to be where a lot of the money leaves the market and a lot of the liquidity dries up. So you might see some 10% corrections, 20, 25, 30% maybe across certain singles and slabs, and certain sealed product, you might see like a 10% retracement. Otherwise, mostly just stagnation over the next few months. So yeah, that's what I got, guys. That's my opinion of where the market's heading right now and what the data tells us. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I would love to know your guys' thoughts. Is the summer slowdown real? Are a bunch of YouTubers just kind of making this up without really looking at the data? I would love to know your guys' thoughts. So post a comment down below, like, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.